A Great Lakes state, a stone's throw away from Canada, Michigan has long been a frontier region. From a fur trapping hub to a farming and industrial powerhouse, the state has a rich historical legacy, which we'll explore in this video. Michigan's Paleo-Indian settlement spanned thousands of years and is attested to by the numerous archaeological finds across the state. From these early and purely nomadic groups, the forest cultures would emerge. Settled primarily along the plentiful shoreline of the Great Lakes and inland waterways, these groups were the cultural ancestors of the Anishinaabe tribal groups, who continue to inhabit the region to this day. Supported by a plentiful, temperate forest ecosystem and rich fishing from the Great Lakes and rivers, diverse and distinct cultures were able to develop and flourish. Agriculture supplemented a semi-nomadic lifestyle, as well as a rich copperworking culture fueled by high-purity deposits in the region. Michigan was also included within the Hopewell Trade Network, an extensive web of interconnected groups running from the southern states up to the Great Lakes. This period of around 1000 BC to 1000 AD saw extensive mound building, as in sister state Illinois, but also petroglyphs unique to Michigan. One such site, now a historic national park, features petroglyphs created by the Anishinaabe people. Here, 165 glyphs can be seen across a rocky outcrop, a way to pass down traditional knowledge and history through the generations. Into the 1500s, and a complex series of migrations seem to have occurred, including peoples such as the Ojibwe and Miami into the region of Michigan. This was in part a knock-on effect of another migration, that of Iroquoian peoples from central Canada's south to the Great Lake region, not the last time the Iroquois tribal groups would make their presence felt across these territories. As with Illinois, the first European expedition was by a Frenchman, Etienne Brulé, a fascinating individual who had spent considerable time living amongst the native Huron tribe, learning their customs and language. He would take commissions from Champlain, an influential French colonial figure of the time, to explore the region further and assimilate with the native peoples. It was during this time that Brulé explored much of Michigan and most of the Great Lakes. With Quebec City as the beating heart of French operations, these early expeditions helped lay the groundwork for a trade network that would eventually stretch out vast distances west and south. Though Brulé would die in mysterious circumstances while embedded with the Huron, the floodgates had been opened. More explorers would follow him, and with the steady growth in importance of the fur trade through the 1600s, the trapping industry too. These Great Lake regions would become some of the richest hunting grounds in the world, and France was able to leverage their unique position in the region to dominate the trade for over a century. As French trappers traveled further in search of beaver pelts, the trade network expanded, and more native groups became involved. The huge revenues available from the industry would lead to the earliest European infrastructure in the state in the form of trading posts along waterways to facilitate the purchase of furs from native people. These, in turn, would pave the way for forts and settlements, the first of which would be Sault Ste. Marie in the northern Upper Peninsula area. Founded by French missionary Jacques Marquette, it was followed by the first fort at the site of modern-day Detroit in 1701. This broadly reflects the main French interests of the period, extracting wealth in the form of animal pelts and importing Christianity to the native people via religious orders such as the Jesuits. Unlike later periods, large-scale settlement wasn't pursued. This helped prevent significant friction over settlement on native land. So, while the introduction of the pelt trading networks and accompaniments such as firearms, liquor, and disease to native communities was heavily disruptive at times, it was not a challenge to their ownership of the land. Moving towards the national era and a new age of settlement, this would all soon change. The British and French had been jostling for position on the North American continent throughout the 1600s, with conflicts in Europe having their own theaters here. Native allies, alongside militia and official troops, were used to do battle around the Great Lakes and surrounding regions in a series of flare-ups. However, these dynamics would dramatically shift with the conclusion of the French-Indian War in 1763. Here, the defeated France lost most of its vast American holdings to the British, bringing to a close their century-and-a-half-long official presence in the region of Michigan. The period from 1763 to the start of the Revolutionary War was marked by distrust and an upset of the dynamics which had existed between native tribes and the French before. The British operated differently and alienated many local natives with their approach. This fermented serious tribal resistance in the region, which would erupt first in Pontiac's War and culminate in the rebellion of Tecumseh some decades later. Though Michigan was on the periphery of the main theaters of the War of Independence, it was used by the British as a staging ground for attacks from Fort Detroit on American settlers. Its strategic position near the Canadian border and Britain's main bases of operation in Quebec and Montreal meant Fort Detroit was a useful asset to project power into the southern Michigan and Ohio regions. Fort St. Joseph also saw action and was taken from the British by a combined Spanish and French force in 1781. With the war's conclusion and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Michigan Territory was handed over to the USA. In 1787, it was then incorporated into the Northwest Territory. This was a mix of newly acquired regions by the nation, which included parts of modern-day Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan. The Northwest Territory made up much of the old French fur-trading heartlands and, as such, had experienced relatively little European settlement compared to eastern seaboard states. The new U.S. authority over it was rejected by the tribes living there, which produced one of the national government's first native uprisings. A confederacy known as the Western Alliance had formed under the leadership of Shawnee Chief Blue Jacket, and in the period between 1786 and 1795, he would lead his warriors against the U.S. government. Known as the Northwest Indian War, it saw some notable native success, including the wipeout of U.S. Commander St. Clair's troops at the Battle of the Wabash. It involved a complex patchwork of alliances, which included the support of Great Britain for the rebellion. This illustrates the threats posed to the early U.S. government by external meddling. Ultimately, the Native Confederacy would be overpowered by U.S. forces, suffering a final loss at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Following the defeat of the last major native resistance, American settlement had been gradually increasing, especially from the New England area. Michigan briefly became a part of Indiana Territory in 1800, with most of it then declared as Michigan Territory in 1805. It would take the population growth of the coming decades, though, to allow it to become a state, with the 60,000 resident threshold crossed in 1833. However, a land dispute with neighboring Ohio regarding the Toledo Strip had delayed the process. The 468 square mile area of land, which included the city by the same name, was eventually granted to Michigan by President Jackson and demonstrates the, at the time, haphazard process of state creation and early territorial divides. Following these delays, it eventually became the 26th state of the Union on January 26, 1837. Michigan embarked on a bold development program after it gained statehood. Particular focus was given to infrastructure programs, including the 3 cross-state railways and new roads. It relied upon borrowing, though, and with an inflationary crisis in 1837, many of the projects ran into trouble, nearly bankrupting the state. However, they reflected its ambition and desired direction of travel. The same can be said of the state's early focus on education, which built on the legacy of the University of Michigan, established in 1817. It was also a progressive state from the outset, embarking on reform in areas such as crime and punishment well ahead of its time. This included removing whipping posts at the state penitentiary, with a focus instead on humane punishment and the novel idea of rehabilitation. Capital punishment was outlawed in 1846 following the mistaken execution of an innocent, and a pioneering mental institution was also established in 1856. It was strongly anti-slavery, helped by the fact that almost no residents were born in the Deep South. With its abolitionist beliefs and proximity to Canada, it also became an important point on the Underground Railroad network, which helped black slaves flee from the South to freedom. By the mid-19th century, Michigan had been expanding its economic base. Still primarily an agricultural state, the discoveries of large deposits of iron and copper ore helped add export revenue, with a canal network built to facilitate the material's transport. New fertile land in the South had also been opened up, making the state the largest national supplier of wheat for a period. A pioneering agricultural college, as well as the massive rollout of celery growing inland and fruit growing around Lake Michigan, helped cement this position as a farming heavyweight. Railway infrastructure had developed fast too, making it a well-connected state with goods transported quickly. This, in turn, would help facilitate a huge natural resources boom from around 1850 onwards in copper and iron ore, but particularly timber. Michigan's significant wooded areas provided ample supply, and at its height, the state was supplying a quarter of the nation's timber. Crucially, the huge amounts of profit generated from the wood industry would help lay the foundations for the state's next major industrial chapter in the form of the automobile. As the Civil War erupted with the bombardment of Fort Sumter, Michigan came out strongly for the Union. It, in fact, dispatched an infantry regiment with such speed that it was enough to prompt President Lincoln to famously state, "Thank God for Michigan," on their arrival in Washington in May 1861. More than 20% of the male population of Michigan would serve in Union forces during the war, and despite heavy casualties from those enlisted, the state itself was spared major damage, allowing it to emerge from the war economically strong. Into the 20th century, and the economy was transforming from a resource extraction and farming hub towards more industry and processing. The gradual growth of its industrial base and revenues from the earlier lumber trade meant it was ideally placed to capitalize on the automobile boom from the turn of the century. Though not the home state of the automobile, Michigan would become central to its story. The earlier carriage and wagon industry, which had been built up in Michigan, including by many timber barons looking to diversify, meant that there was already an infrastructure in place to shift attention towards a new, motorized equivalent of this product. The transition started to occur around the turn of the century, with Ransom Olds of Lansing helping produce one of the first widely available vehicles. This sparked an interest of others, including a certain Henry Ford who, after years of experimentation from his Detroit plant, released the Model T in 1908. This vehicle would transform the automobile industry, and with Ford's pioneering mass production techniques, he was able to roll it out at a scale never seen before. The affordable price point also made it widely accessible, helping fuel not just a transport but a cultural revolution across America. When combined with the build-out of the national road network during the period, it was a major transformation of the nation. Many other manufacturers built up operations in Detroit, and by 1940, 60% of the world's cars were being made in Michigan. This was a significant economic stimulus to the state, and as well as boosting investment and tax revenue, also led to a population boom in major cities. Detroit, for example, experienced more than a 500% increase in population between 1910 and 1930. Michigan was hit hard by the Great Depression due to its industrial base. It would take World War II and the huge spike in demand it generated to revive its fortunes. The state was also a significant producer of armaments during the war, earning itself the nickname the Arsenal of Democracy. Civilian automobile production was in fact completely shut down and turned over to the war effort in February 1942, with the state producing over 25,000 tanks and 8,500 B-24 bombers during the period. Following the end of World War II, and against the backdrop of continued economic strength in Michigan, another significant migration of African Americans from southern states would take place. This great migration had been occurring at varying levels since the start of the century, with many of the migrants leaving economic hardship in the southern states for the promise of employment in industrial hubs such as Detroit. This in turn altered social dynamics, leading to flare-ups throughout the 1960s and civil rights era, including the Detroit riot of 1967. The economic boom would also give birth to a new middle class in the post-war years, contributing to the growing trend of suburbanization in Michigan's big cities. As the auto industry suffered setbacks and closures from the 1970s onwards, the situation only got worse. What had once been buzzing working-class neighborhoods were now often boarded up and crime-ridden. It would take serious state investment and projects towards the end of the 20th century to turn this trend around. A new focus on tourism and the growth of the tech sector also helped drive this transformation. Though challenges would continue for cities like Detroit, with it declaring bankruptcy in 2013, the renewal continues for these former industrial areas. From a fur-trapping hub of the early colonial period through its heyday as the lumber capital of the nation and dominant player in the auto industry, it would have been hard to imagine that this frontier backwater would transform into one of the industrial centers of the nation. A unique state with a rich historical legacy, Michigan looks set to continue to play an important role into the future. Big thanks to our amazing patrons for making this video possible. Your support means the world to us. If you'd like to help us keep creating and get early access to our videos, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks, consider becoming a member right here on YouTube or joining us on Patreon. Every bit of support helps. And as always, thank you so much for watching.